Welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Mattimore and Cronin,
And I'm Brett Ewer.
and today we're discussing the future of the presidency. That means we'll discuss who is likely to win the 2020 election, how the impeachment trial in the Senate is likely to turn out, how a future president should address issues around Iran, China, and election security, and finally, how the presidency itself is likely to evolve in the future. So, Brett, to start, let's talk about the Democratic primary field. So since we last spoke, a number of candidates have dropped out. Cory Booker dropped out, Marianne Williamson, Julian Castro, Kamala Harris, and Beto. So only 6 candidates actually qualified for the most recent debate that happened just a few days ago. And those are Warren, Biden, Buttigieg, Sanders, Klobuchar, and Steyer. Or Buttigieg, sorry. I always say his name.
It's easy, you know, easy to mispronounce. Yeah.
Right. So Yang did not qualify, which I'm bummed about, but he is still running. And Michael Bloomberg is definitely like playing his own game, which apparently doesn't involve showing up to the debates. So my question for you, given everything that's changed since we last spoke, what are your current thoughts on who did best in the most recent debate and who now is best positioned to win the Democratic nomination?
I think it's tough to say who really performed best without really considering what the point of the debate was. The point of the debate really was to spice up the campaigns just before the caucuses. I think we now have 3 weeks until February 3rd in Iowa when the caucuses happen. And for the networks, that really means inducing drama, as well as focusing on some policy issues. But, I think it really comes down to who escaped looking the best, or at least avoiding the biggest gaffe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it actually, I think, and this is not what I would hope for, but I think Joe Biden came across very well, mostly because I think he was given softball questions, and because I think the framing of a lot of the questions was
the framing was
intentionally
pretty biased. It seemed like, especially with the Warren and Sanders dispute. They so. Just a little background, because I agree. Basically, the point right now is how do we stir up drama so that voters can actually decide who to vote for. And most of the area that needs drama stirring up is between Warren and Sanders, because they have a very similar base. So now it's like, okay, who are you actually going to vote for? Who do you want as the progressive candidate? And for people that don't know the background, so Warren claims that Sanders said privately, a woman cannot win the presidency. And Sanders, Bernie, denies saying that. So in the debate, CNN asked a question to Sanders about, basically, is it, did you actually say this or not? He stuck with his original story and said, I did not say that. It's not true. And then they went to Warren and said, okay, we know you said it. We know Bernie said that. So given that, they basically pretty much sided with her. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, is that an effective strategy with Warren? Also, who do you believe, and how do you think it's going to affect voter support?
Well, I'm going to start by saying that I kind of have my feet in both camps.
Mm-hmm.
I support Bernie from an electoral position. I used to intern for Senator Warren, and I know, a lot of her people, and I think that, overall, she would be a great candidate and a great president, policymaker, all that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think to really get to the core of this, we have to look at the original CNN story. It was that the sources were 2 people who were familiar with the conversation, which happened between Senator Sanders and Warren in 2018, and then 2 people who were immediately briefed by Senator Warren after the dinner.
Mm-hmm.
So, right off the bat, all of the sourcing pretty much comes down to Senator Warren. And you can say that there's degrees of credibility because there are people who have this account directly after it happened, right? But we're still relying entirely on one person and their sole account and then kind of throwing it back on the other person, Senator Sanders, to effectively react against what is an
Hmm.
accusation of sexism, and then say, hold on, no, I didn't say that at all. So I think that it's important to look at the story and actually consider whether the sourcing is right. Again, I'm not a journalist,
Yeah.
but all of us are.
Right. I mean, it seems to me like if I had to guess who was telling the truth, it seems likely that Bernie did say something to that effect, but he probably meant it more like, look, in 2016, with the way the country currently stands, it'd be hard for a woman to win the presidency. Not saying that he wouldn't want a woman to win the presidency or he wouldn't support a woman, but just stating the affairs of what was going on at the time. But it seems like a strategic move by Warren to make this a big play, to basically insinuate, Bernie, he's kind of a sexist. The Bernie bros, they've always been a little, sexist, like video gamers eating Cheetos in their basement. Like, we don't really want that. We want, the nice, upstanding, truly woke people who are the Warren supporters.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised I'm actually saying this, but I agree with the Washington Post's reporting on this. The Washington Post does a lot of good work. I'm
Hmm.
unfairly maligning them, but I'm going to quote them. They say, two people with knowledge of the conversation at the 2018 dinner at Warren's home told the Washington Post that Warren brought up the issue by asking Sanders whether he believed a woman could win. One of the people with knowledge of the conversation said Sanders did not say a woman couldn't win, but rather that Trump would use nefarious tactics against the Democratic nominee.
Hmm.
So I can really see both sides here. Language is ambiguous, just generally. I won't go off on a tangent on
Hmm.
that, um, but I could see how both interpretations could live on. I think it was pretty cynically deployed by Warren's campaign, which I assume includes people who, generally come from more of the establishment compared to Bernie's campaign, and so there is
Hmm.
that friction between the two wings of the party, and that information was probably leaked by the more establishment folks, and it was done in a way to gin up support
Hmm.
for a candidate, frankly, who's falling in the polls from her peak in the fall of 2019.
Right. It might be a way to siphon off some of Bernie's female supporters or female-minded supporters. So it is interesting to see the repercussions of this feud. Some are good, some are bad for both candidates. So, for instance, with Bernie, he raised on that single day of Tuesday when this was all in the news, $1.7 million dollars in donations from individual supporters who basically got all riled up about, Warren claiming that Bernie is a liar on national TV. And it already trending on Twitter since Tuesday has been hashtag never Warren, hashtag Warren is a snake, hashtag lying Liz. And this, like, while, yeah, you might see it as good to gin up like a lot of, energy for Bernie's base, it's also not a great look for Bernie to have like his supporters doing vicious attacks like that. And if you look at, some of the polls that have come out since the debate and since this issue from, Nate Silver 538, it looks like people, really did not, they soured on Sanders. He had a net favorability change of negative 3.6, whereas, Warren had a net favorability change of plus 3.9. So it does seem like the public sentiment is a little bit more on Warren's side, even though the diehard Bernie fans have definitely gotten riled up in support of him around this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think however you look at it, it's unfortunate because politics is dirty, especially electoral politics, and during a primary. Um, and and what's so unfortunate is that I feel like this was mostly manufactured um, in order to split a progressive base that actually agrees on so many things. I
Hmm.
mean, when you get down to the policy levels, yes, I tend to agree with Bernie because I think uh, I agree more with his vision and the actual plans and his strategy for kind of coming to the negotiating table asking for more than you would expect to get,
Hmm.
rather than a kind of technocratic proposal that would work at first implementation, but I don't think I don't think Republican leadership would act in good faith, with
Hmm.
like Medicare for all. I think they, industry will try to water it down as much as they can.
Right.
Um, so, it's unfortunate. I think what was really interesting is last night, once the primetime cycle came up, they released uh,
Oh, I saw that. Yeah, the
yeah,
actual hot mic audio.
yeah, and I think the real winner there is Tom Steyer. Um,
I just wanted to say hi, Bernie. And he's like, okay,
yeah,
fine.
yeah,
Yeah.
man. Which is a
And it
friendlier.
did seem very strategic. Like everyone knows that when the debate has just ended, the cameras are still on the candidates. So for Elizabeth Warren to go up to Bernie and say, probably knowing that she's on a hot mic, I have it right here. She said, I think you called me a liar on national TV. And Bernie replied, let's not do it right now. If you want to have that discussion, we'll have that discussion. And then Warren said, anytime. And then Sanders said, you called me a liar. You told me, all right, let's not do this now. So it seems clear that Warren was like, wanted to make it even bigger news. And Sanders was kind of trying to like, no, let's just talk about this like privately. So that kind of shows that this probably came up as a result of a brainstorming session between Warren and her team around an oval table in a conference room. Is what it
Yeah,
seems like to me.
I could definitely see that, and it's I always told my clients when I was prepping them for TV or any mostly TV is you do not speak once you've said your piece and once you've gotten your message out. You don't stay outside of that message and that character until you are out the door of the building.
Yeah.
And for a presidential candidate, that extends to you're that way until you're in the car that's taking you to your hotel.
Right.
Um, I mean, you are always on. That's why it's so exhausting. Some people say, you're always on until you get to the elevator. Nowadays I think it extends
Yeah.
even more. So I agree with your assessment there that I think it was, in a way calculated. And let's not let CNN off the hook here. I mean,
Right.
I think
Right.
I think we like to assume in the best of all worlds that media agencies, media outlets are always acting in their best or in the interest of objectivity, right? They do have an incentive to keep their credibility, but also CNN is owned by AT&T, and
Right.
AT&T does not stand to benefit from uh, Sanders, certainly not, and Warren
Right.
probably, they stand to benefit from a divided, from the progressive wing of the party being divided.
Right. Yeah, like I saw some of the chyrons from CNN that were like, should Bernie have to answer for how he will pay for healthcare? And it's like the way they word questions, it just makes you feel like he's a crazy person that has crazy ideas. What the chyron should say is like, Sanders on how to pay for healthcare. Not
Yeah,
like,
I mean, yeah, one of the chyrons I took it down was Sanders' proposals would double federal spending over a decade. How will he avoid bankrupting the country?
right,
When
right.
it's like, okay, you
Yeah,
didn't ask that for any of the questions about our engagements in the Middle East, which have cost us trillions of dollars over the past
yeah.
20 years. I mean, any, it's just
Exactly. So
it.
that actually segues to a good point, which is the whole issue with Iran and how the candidates performed relative to that issue. Because I agree with you that I think Biden had a really strong performance. I think Klobuchar had a strong performance. And I think part of the reason why they both had a strong performance is because they were both moderates and they both gave the impression that if they are elected and they're commander in chief, that they will do what's right for the safety of Americans and the safety of the world, which may include keeping some troops in strategic areas in Iran and Iraq, wherever it's needed, so we can have some bases to deploy drones and surveillance and have spies and whatever else we need, not necessarily to do like a full-fledged ground attack, but just to have strategic presence. Whereas for Warren and Sanders, both of their answers were basically we need to take troops out right away and use diplomacy. And that's great. Like, obviously, that's what we would love to do, but it's hard to have leverage in diplomacy once you've already made it clear that you're going to take troops out. So I'm curious if you have a similar assessment of that issue about Iran.
Yeah, again, I think it was a question of framing. I think that the people always brought it back to, specifically Biden, Klobuchar, and Buttigieg talked about protecting, citizens, which is obviously important, but also interests. And that's where it gets murky because interests range from exactly what you're saying, which is, we need to have a presence so that we can supply our allies, so that we can have a presence to protect our allies. But then that could also extend to, we need to have a geopolitical presence because we have a lot of commerce in that area and we need to protect, our economic empire. And we as voters need to be informed enough to say, hold on, I don't think we should put money towards this specific interest, but we should put it towards this one. And it gets caught up in, the necessary confidentiality of national security issues. But yeah, I think Klobuchar and Biden, and to a lesser extent, Buttigieg came across pretty strongly in that part of the debate. But I think I would chalk a lot of that up to the framing of CNN's questioning.
Yeah, I did like how Buttigieg made it clear. Like, it seems like Buttigieg's whole strategy in this debate was, hey, I'm the young guy who knows future stuff, and all these old folks are just going to lead us down the same path that we've been going down. And I thought that's a pretty good strategy. And when he talks about war, he made it really clear to talk about cybersecurity, election security, climate security, working with young emerging leaders around the world. And he made a pretty good argument for being the young candidate that can make that happen. However, he has had some trouble in the polls recently where, I don't know if you saw the most recent numbers, but as according to Real Clear Politics, which tracks over time, basically Bloomberg is now rising to surpass Buttigieg for the number 4 slot, whereas Buttigieg is declining. So, and pretty much Biden has been fairly steady at the top. Then Sanders and Warren are like neck and neck. They sort of flip back and forth. And then you've got Buttigieg, but he's about to be overtaken by Bloomberg. And then you have Yang and Klobuchar and Steyer, who are lower. So I'm curious if you think Buttigieg still has a shot, or you think, Twitter mob has already decided they don't like him, and it's not so likely that he will be a nominee.
I think a way he could survive is if he takes a lot of that Yang energy that you're talking about, being young, being able to address things that aren't being addressed on the national stage because the other candidates are older, or maybe they just aren't focusing on that. That's not where their head is. Like cybersecurity, new leaders, taking on those, I might not necessarily fully agree with them, but the positions that Yang took that are completely outside of the political norm, like UBI.
Right.
I mean, things like that, which should be worth considering, but had never been considered. I think that's the only way that Buttigieg really maintains himself, because, you're right. Bloomberg's in it. I mean, he can self-fund. I don't know about you. Anytime I go on YouTube or Twitter, I get blasted.
I see a lot of ads. But the thing with Bloomberg is that I see a lot of ads, but if you asked me like what's his message, I couldn't tell you. Like, I have no idea what his tagline is, what his core message is. So it's like a lot of ad spend, but no sticky message.
And it's not even just ad spend. I heard from, and I'll keep my sourcing opaque on this. I heard from someone who works for another campaign. I'll just say another campaign. He found out what Bloomberg's state directors get paid. State directors, are the people that handle, anything within a state. So that means, all of the media, all of the field organizing, the ground game, all of the activities in a state, all of the delegate amassing, everything. The political maneuvering. Those political directors for Mike Bloomberg get paid around $300,000 to $350,000.
Wow.
In the world of campaign politics, that is massive. I mean, campaign politics, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
if you're, I've known people that are mid-tier for a federal campaign that are working 16-hour days, eating pizza, drinking booze, and like sleeping on a cot. Like that's the
yeah.
kind of life, or
Do you think
sleeping
that
in.
means he has a better team?
No. I think it means because a lot of people who go into electoral politics are driven by, or campaign politics are driven by conviction. I
Right.
mean, as they should be, I would hope.
Yeah.
You know, uh, no, I think he might be able to get, some good people and some better people, but, money is his strength. And he's going to stay in it, especially if someone like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders got the nomination.
Right.
He's,
If it's
you know,
not a moderate, then he has a better chance than if it is a moderate who has
yeah,
the other main slot. Yeah,
or
so I want to like we should then talk about how we think the impeachment situation is going to turn out with Trump and all of that. But before we get into that whole area, I'm curious to think about predictions of future scenarios in a mini sense of which candidate, if nominated, would beat Trump or do we think would have a likely chance of beating Trump. So we can sort of go down the list and I mean I have my own thoughts, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts of like, for instance, Biden versus Trump, Warren versus Trump, Sanders versus Trump. Let's start with those three. Do you think any of those, which of those three do you think is most likely to defeat Trump if nominated?
I'll start with the person I think would probably be least likely,
Uh-huh.
is Senator Warren, and I say that out of,
Oh,
you
interesting.
know, I mean out of the top tier,
Right, right.
top tier of the Democratic Party. Um, I say that because I think that there is overwhelming, just I think people are generally, uh, there's underlying current of sexism. We can't deny that. The people are unused to women leaders, and so they unfairly prejudice people,
Mm-hmm.
based off of that, and that's not right. But also, as someone from, as a fast talker from Massachusetts, snarky, fat, a lot of people across the country don't have that similar affect, and it can come
Right.
across, it can rub people the wrong way. Trust me, I've rubbed a lot of people the wrong way in my life, going around the country. There's a certain way of presenting, and while I support her along with Senator Sanders, I think that, also aside from the biases that people will have against her personally, on a demographic level, I think generally the vision she presents, is not as expansive. I think Bernie would have a better shot based off of the polling I've seen and based off of I think the expansiveness of his vision, which is that you're not talking about what people deserve or what people, uh, a plan to fix something. It's about what people deserve in a society,
Hmm.
and it's about implementing a moral and ethical vision of what you view society as being, and bringing that into the political realm. And I think that that resonates quite a bit, at least with people I've talked to around the country. People really like that and the authenticity. Um,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
Bernie's a curmudgeon, and even if you disagree with him, people still really respect that.
Yeah.
Um, with Biden, I think he's got a great shot because he's also, um, he's comfortable. I mean, he represents the establishment, the Obama era. A lot of people were doing, decently, or they were recovering during that time from the economic crisis. And, he's kind of like, for a lot of people, I think, who don't get involved in the nitty gritty, he's kind of like a bowl of like warm tomato soup and a
Yeah.
grilled cheese. Like he's comfort food. I
Yeah.
mean, for a lot of people, they're so disturbed by what's been going on with with the current president, where there's just a flurry, a media circus every day of corruption, and
Yeah.
insanity. Policy making by tweet. They just want to go back to something normal. Um,
Yeah. It's interesting your predictions because they seem like they're fairly in line with how Trump is thinking about the situation. Because with the whole Warren versus Sanders debate, Trump pretty much sided with Sanders' version of events, and it seems like he did that because he would sort of rather go up against Warren than go up against Sanders, perhaps. And he also has made obviously the whole subject of the impeachment is because he wanted interference to basically dig up dirt against Joe Biden, because it seems like of all the candidates, the one Trump is most worried about is Joe Biden, because it's really hard to peg him as this like communist extremist just given who Joe Biden is and what his positions are. And that's kind of the best strategy the GOP have. So, and I don't know if you've been following sort of the hacking reporting that the New York Times has done, but essentially the Ukrainian company that Hunter Biden worked for, Joe Biden's son, recently they found there was a lot of pretty sophisticated phishing activity for those companies. So Fancy Bear, which is the Russian hacking group that is, directly associated with the Kremlin, Fancy Bear set up fake websites for all of these subsidiaries of the Ukrainian oil company. And they used good domains, like .com domains that sounded exactly like the real website. And not only that, but they made the website look exactly like the original website, and they had login functionality, so they would have people who thought they were going to the normal website enter their login information, and they have already hacked into that system. So it's quite likely that just like in 2016, where the John Podesta emails got dumped right before the election and definitely influenced the election. I don't care what anyone says, like public sentiment in the media was definitely impacted. Yeah. That similar thing could happen right before the 2020 election with a dump of all these emails from Hunter Biden, maybe even Joe Biden. And the thing is, it almost doesn't matter what's in the emails. People are going to find something, and just the news of, oh, there was some big dump, it makes it seem like there's something nefarious. So if Biden is elected, I agree with you. I think he's probably one of the most likely to defeat Trump, but it's probably going to be quite a battle, similar to the Hillary and Trump battle in 2016.
It's fascinating. Well, you're describing phishing, and I'm sure most of the audience knows this, but I just learned of a recent phishing attempt where I don't know, it wasn't like Fancy Bear or any APT. It was some other hacker ring that created a complete copy of Google's homepage, but they changed the font on the G's in Google. They changed the font. So instead of the G, instead of the loop on the bottom completely wrapping up to the loop on the top, it was a loop on the bottom with a hanging, a hanging sort of appendage. And that fooled enough people so that they were able to access people's Gmail accounts.
Wow.
And I mean, completely reroute traffic. So it's scary how easy it is. And I agree with you. The information manipulation game definitely works, but I want to counter by saying I think it works in situations where you're dealing with people who are running for office and are playing a political game. And by that I mean someone who's trying to optimize just, exactly where they're going to get the exact number of votes from. We're going to get 5% in Wisconsin, we're going to get 4% here, and we're going to have these margins. If you're walking on that tight, on tight margins like that, then yeah, you are susceptible to disinformation campaigns that will sway a certain percentage of the public. But why I think Sanders has a decent shot is because all of his messaging, the political revolution, not me, us, is all about building a broad grassroots base that stays engaged with policymaking, that can be called on whenever there is a political fight that needs to be fought. And it's based on improving people's day-to-day conditions.
Right.
Both of us, and I'm sure a lot of listeners, are comfortable in their lives, but there are a lot of people who are living very on the edge, paycheck to paycheck, having to go to food banks, and they're
I mean, I like Bernie. I consider him a living American hero, but at the same time, he is someone who's fairly easy to brand as like a crazy leftist extremist. So I wonder how effective that would be if it did come down to Trump versus Sanders. Whereas if it was someone like Yang, who has a lot of the same messages and same inspiration as Sanders, where, yeah, it's all about the people who have been disenfranchised and how can we make their life better in a real way day to day. But it's not as much about being on the left. It's like, Yang's whole thing is not left, not right, forward. So, I mean, my own personal predictions is that I think the only way Trump would have a chance of being defeated would be if it was against a moderate that's not scary in like a left extreme way. So I think Biden has a good shot. I think Yang has a good shot. I think Klobuchar maybe, but I don't think she's inspirational enough. And I will say I actually sort of maybe think that Warren has a better shot than Bernie, personally.
I guess my issue with, other than the problems that I've identified with Senator Warren's campaign in running against Trump is that he is a bully. I mean, he's just one of the worst. And I have a feeling that she would respond almost too much in good faith. Like she would criticize him on things that he absolutely should be criticized for and are completely valid points that disqualify him from holding anything above, local dog catcher. Maybe not even that.
Right.
But, I think she plays too much within the bounds of like safe political discourse. So here's an example. Was what was it 2 years ago now when she tried to counter all of these racist attacks, the Pocahontas thing, all of that.
Terrible miscalculation.
Yeah, instead of just saying
it's not important.
No, instead of saying this isn't important, right. I'm running on these policies. Fuck you. Instead,
Yeah, I was annoyed that so many times during the debate last time, people said, well, this helps out black and brown people. I heard that term so many times, and it's like, we shouldn't care about, like, race shouldn't be interesting to us. It should be helping out people who are poor and people who need help, people who need healthcare and better income and better benefits. But it does seem like at this stage, everyone's like strategically trying to get like very specific, groups of the electorate, and it's a little bit it doesn't rub off the right way for me.
I think it's a cynical approach because it falsely bifurcates class issues versus racial issues when they are entirely intermeshed. I mean, you can't think about how much of the working class is black people or brown people. I mean, go back to full American history. I mean, go back to the Columbian Exchange, and you're going to find that most of the history on this continent, as it's been recorded, by Europeans or otherwise, does involve exploitation that involves people's economic means being affected by their skin color and by their culture and background. So it's such a cynical play to say, I'm focused on explicitly racial justice without even thinking or even introducing like, well, what does that mean for people's economic situation?
And it brings to mind this chart that, I don't know if you follow the blog Wait But Why, but they did an awesome post recently called Political Disney World. And it was basically about like how politics is just this Disney world where you're caricaturing like good guys and bad guys. And so most people think of it just as a two-dimensional, you have the left and then you have the right and then you have the center. But that's actually a low-dimensional way of thinking about it. A better way to think about it is, you have left and the right on the x-axis, but on the y-axis you have what he calls the psych spectrum, which is how high level are you thinking about it. And the highest level is your motivation is truth and building a more perfect nation, no matter what your personal predilections are, like you're going to do whatever is in line with the truth. Whereas on the bottom, it's like all about confirmation bias, being, it's like your side versus the others. and just winning. And if you look at the curve of how voters tend to behave on different levels of the psychic spectrum, like on the lowest levels where it's all like instinctual tribalism, like I just want to win, I don't even care if the facts are true or not, that tends to be like very largely like just people on the very left or very right. But then as you go up higher, it sort of creates like an arch shape where the people on the highest level tend to be a lot more in the middle. You still can have some high level thinkers that are very progressive or very conservative, but more often than not, the highest level thinkers will be somewhere in the middle. So I wonder how that is going to change over time if we think that it's going to become sort of more tribal in future elections, or if maybe this is the worst in the US, like the most tribal it's going to be, and then it'll just get better from here.
I mean, I tend to view things within the context of, how old are our institutions? How long has it been since they've been changed? And I try to view them within the context of generations and how they view their struggle with each other, along with their struggle with institutions created by other generations. And that's just one dimension, but I tend to focus on that a lot. And I think that since the post-war, since World War II, the last time we had a complete unification of society behind a cataclysmic global threat, the beginning of the atomic age, that kind of thing. You have the 50s and the early 60s where you have pretty much, a general sense of social harmony, and then people identify horrible injustices with it, whether that's treatment of women or of racial and ethnic minorities, leading to the civil rights movement and, all of that. And then you have a general deconstruction of those institutions, like what happened in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then, now we're in a point where we've come to kind of two battling ends that are looking for a different moral and political vision for what society should be. And that's going to be reflected in our institutions. And I think you do see that on the far right. You have people that are like, ethno-state wackos,
Right.
people who are completely nuts. Then I think you have people on the, the far left, who I tend to sympathize with, obviously, a lot more. I think we're coming to a kind of a fever pitch. Where something, one of those extremes is going to win.
By fever pitch, you think it's going to get more extreme from here or less extreme?
I think it will probably get, it's got to come to a climax at some point, and then it will become less extreme because we will have built a foundation of things that we just accept as being, what we should be doing. So, for example, I'll tell you on the left, I think one of the things that I would hope that would become just a fundamental tenet of society, something that just everyone basically agrees on, is, oh crap, like we're at serious risk of climate change, and that affects our day-to-day lives and how we consume and how we interact with the world and ecology, and we need to be very careful with what we do. I would assume that would be a basic building block. And that's just one example. Another could be healthcare. Like, how do we approach people having issues with health? How do we, will we ever decouple a person's productivity and work from the things that they get in terms of food and shelter and healthcare, things like that? Will we move toward a full social democracy?
Right.
But yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a tangent.
No, that's
But
good. Yeah, I want to get into the future scenario of really how we think not only the presidency, but how America is likely to change in the coming few elections. Because I agree, it seems like we're getting to this very, fervent period where everyone's just fired up on both sides, and it seems like it will reach a climax. It doesn't feel like it's reached its supreme level of divisiveness. But once that happens, it does seem like, whether it's a recession or whether some major climate catastrophe happens or whether there's a, hacking in our election that freaks everyone out, or something may happen that would bring us together again. But before we get into just outlining what we think the future scenarios are likely to be, let's just briefly talk about the impeachment trial, because this is something that is just beginning today in the Senate. And I'm curious to you, I have a few questions for you. One is, do you think they're going to end up allowing witnesses? I'm also curious if you think the impeachment trial will end up helping or hurting Trump politically, and if you think that any GOP members will end up defecting in the end.
Well,
So
I
first
think
on the
it's
witnesses, I guess. Yeah.
witnesses. I don't think there will be any witnesses. I think what it's going to come down to is all of these little procedural questions, which are very important. Don't get me wrong. These little procedural questions have an impact on how the later questions are examined and answered. But I don't think witnesses will be allowed. I think what will happen is it will go to the Senate as it has, and Mitch McConnell will act as a lightning rod for people's complaints about the procedures. Democrats will say, this is how it's always been done. There's always been witnesses. He will say, we're in extraordinary times or something or whatever. And then the media won't hold him accountable. His voters won't, because there's a significant portion of the country that already views the impeachment as some sort of a sham. And then there will be tight votes where the moderates, Senator Collins, Senator Murkowski, those two, they're the only ones I can think of right now. I shouldn't unfairly malign just them. There are other moderate Democrat or Republican senators. They will kind of hem and haw about, whether
Romney.
they should or not. Yeah, I mean, I always view former Senator Jeff Flake as like the perfect archetype for this. He was always hemming and hawing and so concerned and blah blah blah. But who the other one is? Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
I can pick on him. He's a good Massachusetts guy. They'll hem and haw about we should stick to procedures and tradition on all this. I'm gravely concerned, but they'll end up voting with the party. They'll fall in line.
Although it does seem like, since you just need a simple majority for a lot of these votes with impeachments, rather than normally you have the tiebreaker with the VP, it does seem like we would only need a few GOP members, to like 3 of them, I think, to side with Democrats in order for witnesses to be allowed. So it seems to me, I seem maybe a little bit more optimistic that they will allow witnesses. Not saying that that'll necessarily change much as far as the end outcome. But I'm also curious if you think, so a lot of people, political experts have said, oh my God, impeaching Trump is the worst thing you can do, because it's just going to energize his base. It's going to make everyone fired up. It's going to make people think that this was all a sham and a witch hunt to begin with. But then you have other people, like the Nancy Pelosi's, that think, not only is this something that must be done ethically and constitutionally, but this is actually a good strategy because we're bringing to light information that can sway voters to make a more informed decision. So I'm curious which of those opinions are most closely resemble your own.
Yeah, I don't think, I think it was largely a mistake in terms of timing, just how they went through the impeachment. I think it will probably energize his base. And the timing issue is that it's being rushed through right now. I mean, it's going to start, Chief Justice Roberts is going to be sworn in this coming Tuesday. So that'll be the 21st of January, 2020. And then I bet the trial will last for maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I mean, it's actually masterfully done. What Senator McConnell has done is that he's going to be dragging away both Senator Warren, Senator Sanders, and Senator Klobuchar from campaigning in Iowa to go to this trial and, to preside over the evidence when, you aren't getting any witnesses really. So it's like, what's the whole point? But even more, what I think is interesting is that the Senate is not allowing media to be freely roaming the Capitol during this time. This is a huge problem. Their proposal is that the media must be I think it's on the second floor of the Senate chamber. They have to be, stuck in that gallery. They can't, usually media is freely roaming around, the cloakroom area, all around the just the hallways around the chamber.
Right,
I mean, it's a
right.
great place to catch a senator. It's a great place, to get a candid take. But no, I mean, what Senator McConnell is doing is he's insulating his people so that they can vote party line, so that they don't have to deal with,
Pressure.
potentially, yeah, and not even gotcha questions, like
Just
very
like
simple questions.
straightforward questions. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think Republican senators are acting hostile already. I just saw a video where Manu Raju, the CNN correspondent, asked Senator McSally from Arizona. He asked her a question, and it wasn't a particular, I don't remember the question, but it wasn't a particularly pointed one. And she just said, "You're a liberal hack." Like, go away. You're a hack. So, I think it's being carefully constructed so that the procedures won't matter. It'll be rushed through, and then it will be rushed through in enough time so that it will kind of fizzle out. And then President Trump can say, "I was acquitted. Doesn't
Right,
matter.
right.
None of this matters." Um, I am, incredibly
Yeah,
cynical about the whole process.
yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to then get into the future scenarios. So we've sort of laid the groundwork. So let's take a quick break and then let's go into the best case scenario first. All right, so Brett, what is the best case scenario for the future of the presidency?
Best case scenario.
As I see it, the best case, at least for this cycle and for the presidency going forward, the institution is I would like for Senator Sanders to win unequivocally. Landslide would be great, but I'll take anything. And then immediate abolition of the Electoral College. That's an entire other conversation.
Yeah.
But I would like for him to win on grand policy proposals that then probably, because of politics, will get watered down a little bit by the power of industry, the health insurance industry foremost. And what will happen there is that we will have a pretty strong gain on moral issues like providing health care to everyone and housing for everyone. There will be pretty strong gains that affect people's material lives day to day. And hopefully that makes people more engaged so that they are able, so that they aren't working 3 jobs to support a family, and that they actually are able to get involved in their communities and affect other political decisions down the chain. So that means state politics, state legislators, legislatures, ballot initiatives, all those things. More civic engagement. That would definitely be the best possible situation. And then I hope that in terms of the office, what I would hope happens to the presidency is that we seriously examine, given the expansion of the administrative state, and given how seemingly easy it was for Donald Trump, a game show host, to become president. I mean, let's not mince words. He was a game show host. He became president because he recognized that politics
Yeah.
was a reality TV show,
He
and he
hacked
played
the
it really
system.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, he hacked the system. I mean, he. Our hope is that, or my hope is that, people recognize that the system is hackable, and that it might be dangerous to give so much power to the executive without there being the other branches of government co-equal exerting against that other power. Even if you're part of the same party, if you're the leader of the Senate and you're the same party as the president, you cannot just sign off on everything. I would hope that there would be more import and prestige with the other co-equal branches, and I would hope that they would also execute their authority with just as much certainty as the president executes initiatives on his authority or her authority.
Definitely. Yeah, I have a lot of the same sentiments, especially around democracy and how can we strengthen democracy rather than weaken democracy. And like you said, by abolishing the Electoral College, we move towards a system where we're doing more what's in line with the actual number of Americans, not the number of counties in the US. Like I saw that, I think I tweeted this on my own Twitter, but it was like, here are all the states that have a less population than Long Beach. And people in LA, like Long Beach, a lot of people who live there say, "Oh yeah, I live in like outside of LA or like in LA." But no. Long Beach on its own is bigger, has more people than like almost half of the states in the US. And it's just incredible when you see the numbers of how hackable the system is, because all you need is to have the right states with a relatively small number of people who all think in a fairly similar sort of way in order to get power. And if you can hack the media as well, like, I don't care what you think about Trump, he's brilliant in that he hacked the media and he hacked the system and he knew what it takes to get enough airtime, and he's willing to say whatever's on his mind, whereas most candidates are afraid to misspeak, one single word. So my best case scenario is that I think, I would obviously like certain candidates to win more. Like Yang is number one on the list for me. But I think someone like Yang or Biden would be most likely not only to defeat Trump, because they're more nonpartisan, but also to help heal the divide, where it's not as much about politics, it's more about what's best for America. So my ideal scenario would be, let's say, and it's probably very unlikely that Yang would win. So let's say Biden wins. The hack and the email dump don't really work against him. He still ends up winning strong enough that it's hard to call the election into question. Like if it's anything close, there's always going to be the question of like, well, is it legitimate? Is it not a legitimate election? But if people think it's legitimate, I actually think that, Trump losing in the election would be the best outcome. The second best would be for Trump if he resigned with some sort of dignity, so that his supporters can maintain some sort of dignity. I think
Save face.
Exactly. I think the worst would be if it got ugly. Like if Trump got imprisoned, which he may deserve to be imprisoned, but I think it'll be really bad for just the political divisiveness of the country. And it would obviously also be bad if Trump was a victor and then started his own like media conglomeration and just became like a powerhouse for all future elections. But, since this is the best case scenario, I think beyond just our current presidency, the presidency itself, the office of the presidency, should be more co-equal with the other branches of government. It should always move towards more democracy rather than less democracy. It should really make important the case of securing our elections and confidence in the outcome of our elections. And we should be leading the world in a moral sense, just the way that, during World War II, like you said, America had this sense of we would always do what's right, even if it's not in the best interests of ourselves. Like we would take wounded soldiers from the enemy and use American doctors to bring them back to life, not because it's good for America, but because that's what America does. And we've lost that in the world, and that's our most powerful asset. Like you can kill every American soldier, but if that idealism still exists about doing what's right because it's right, then America will live on. But if America degrades, then we're going to be more vulnerable than ever.
Could I add something to support your point, which
Sure.
is that too many policy ideas are based off of a sort of tit for tat approach or like a transactional approach, when really it should be about what do we as a society want to do. Mm-hmm. So an example of this would be like, without going on too much of a tangent, the death penalty. A lot of people say, well, yeah, we should keep it as an option because, there are some crimes which are just so beyond the pale that it stokes our, it works our vengeance muscle or whatever.
Right.
But, I view the opposition to it, regardless of, obviously it doesn't work. There's the possibility that you kill someone who's innocent, which is, a sin for any civilized society. it's less about those issues, and it's more about just, no, we don't want to live in a society which sanctions state murder. And it's about what we want the world to be like. And I know that sounds corny,
Yeah.
but maybe it's time for people to be corny and less, ironic and cynical, and more actually active in making the world better.
Definitely. Yeah. Awesome. So what do you think is the worst case scenario for the future of the presidency?
Worst case scenario.
All right, hear me out. This might seem harebrained, but what I think is going to happen in the worst case is that you have a convention, a Democratic convention that is brokered, and it's brokered to support someone who is a compromise candidate between the progressive left and the establishment centrists in the Democratic Party, and they choose someone who might not be the best choice, but because there's such a strong rift, maybe not the best campaigner or whatever, but because there's such a strong rift, they need to patch things up. And then that person, runs in the general. Mike Bloomberg stays in the race because he's not satisfied, because he wants a centrist establishment person. And then President Trump wins. And the way I could see that playing out is very similar to what happened in Maine for their gubernatorial election in 2010 and 2014. There was an independent candidate who got about 38% or something, or 35. There was a Democratic candidate who also got, somewhere in the mid to low 30s, and then there was a Republican candidate, Paul LePage, who became governor, who was, and probably forever will be, a horse's ass. The guy's a complete tool. And he won twice because of this, three-way split. It might work out differently on the federal level because of how the Electoral College works and how the House, how the House might step in if no one wins the college outright and all of that. But that is my worry, is that the opposition to Trump is split because potentially because one billionaire decides that he doesn't like, he takes his ball and goes home. So that's the worst case as I see it. And then Trump becomes president again. He views it as his mandate, even when he doesn't have one. We continue, an even worse slide into losing global credibility, having climate change get worse, having domestic politics continue to be a complete and utter shit show, with very little getting done when now is the time for things to get done. And in terms of what that means for the presidency as an office, I worry that the longer that Donald Trump stays in office, the more that we normalize sort of unaccountable behavior. Maybe not dictatorial, but the administrative state is pretty powerful. And the longer he is there and the longer his political appointees remain at agencies and departments, the longer they can set norms. And that's a little scary because, one, I disagree with just the Republican Party in general and their platform. But two, Donald Trump is the fringe of the Republican Party. He's a wacko. So that worries me. Pretty much staying the course worries me.
Yeah. I'm fairly concerned when it comes to this, and I agree with your assessment about what the worst lead up would be, where there's a brokered convention and then there's a split decision, and the Democratic Party is not consolidated in its support for one candidate. So I'm not going to dispute that. I am also concerned about how the system may become increasingly even more gameable than it has been in the past, where we're seeing, there's already the Republican-controlled Senate, given the way that, gerrymandering and the electorate are composed. But there could also be a situation where we could have a stacked Republican Supreme Court in the very near future, especially with, RBG's health issues. And that would be, troublesome to then have essentially all branches of the government behind someone who's, clearly does not have the same sort of values that the founders had in mind. And although one thing I think that's even scarier is the hackability of the election from outside interference. And I'm concerned that right now, a lot of the infrastructure, especially on these state levels, is so bad and so easy to manipulate. And we've had all these issues that aren't even necessarily someone hacking the system, but just the system not working because it was designed in the 80s on like Microsoft Word or Minecraft or something. It's like just a horrible system. And I worry that if something happens where the results of the election are called into question and people lose confidence that the results are actually what people voted, that could trigger a loss of confidence that if that combined with a recession, and we are overdue for a recession. I mean, if you look at like the stock market, like every crash, there's like a big crash right around the .com. There's a big crash right around 2008. There's typically a recession every 10 years. It's now been more than 10 years since the 2008 crash. Stock market's at an all-time high. We've been printing more money than ever. And aside from like the mortgage subprime crisis that happened in 2008, that's still an issue. It's not like they really started performing better since then. But the even bigger issue is the subprime student loan crisis, which a lot of people aren't going to be able to pay their loans, and that's the biggest asset the government has, on top of how the deficit has been building tremendously, debt has been building. So part of my concern is that all of these forces may coalesce into a systems collapse. And I'm not saying this is likely, the most likely case, but since we're in the worst case, my worst case is that the lack of confidence, the stock market, bad practices with finance and real estate and the dollar, all of these result in a systems collapse that makes America no longer a real leader in the world. And that creates a vacuum where China and Russia and other, big actors can sort of fill in that void. And so I think, like, as far as the presidency is concerned, I think if it just becomes more and more powerful and it becomes more like a dictatorship or like like what the founders tried to get away from, like being a king. There was, I forget who quoted this, but someone said, well, if we're not going to allow witnesses in the Senate trial, we may as well just give Trump a crown and a scepter, because we're essentially not actually giving a real trial, which is what it was in the Constitution. And so that's my big concern, is that the presidency essentially transforms into a dictatorship that then sort of colludes with the other branches of government, and it results in a systems collapse that then allows China to fill in the void.
I agree with you, and I want to make some cosmetic suggestions to that idea, which is, I'm always loath to make comparisons to Rome or any of that because it's hacky and overdone. But I think in this instance, you can make a valid comparison between the role of the president in relation to a legislature or in relation to the Senate in particular, with the Roman Principate era. Principate era, the era between Augustus and what I think Nero, or actually no, I mean extending into what I think 150 AD or something like that, before the Dominate. The difference here is so the characterization here is that you have an executive, the emperor or the president, who is the real power behind everything. I mean, they run the military. They have pretty much everyone in their pocket. They are the power, but they're referred to as princeps, which is the first among equals. They're like the chief. So they're considered, they're given, nominally they have their own office and they are subject to checks and balances and all of these controls. But in terms of norms and customs, people start to just defer to the executive, and people in the Senate forget that Senate and other legislative bodies and independent entities, states, forget that they also have their own duties to fulfill, and they just start deferring because politics has become national and is no longer so local.
Right.
So I view that as being a potential I think it's in line with what you're saying. I mean, maybe not strictly a dictatorship, but I view that as being somewhere on the road to a dictatorship is where
Right.
people
More like
forget.
Russia, where they still have elections, but they're kind of sham elections, and they just like switch between Putin and one of his stodgies.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you check off the necessary procedural boxes so that you create different offices for people to inhabit while they act as a gray eminence and actually control things.
Hmm.
Um, you know that's pretty concerning.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's move down now to the most likely scenario. What do you think is the most likely scenario for the future of the presidency?
Most likely scenario.
So for the election, I think what's going to happen is a centrist, probably Biden, will win in a brokered election. And I think what's going to happen is Senator Warren and Senator Sanders have oodles of money. I mean, they're doing really well in terms of money. They have enough, and they have their own infrastructure, both of them, to last a fairly long time through the primaries. And they're going to rack up a lot of delegates. And what's going to happen, I think, is that they're going to get to the convention, and no one's going to have enough delegates to win on the first round. And what will happen there is whoever's ahead, if they're smart, will try to secure those delegates before their opponents or colleagues' delegates before that first round of voting, so that they actually can clinch the nomination on that first round. So there's got to be smart backroom deals going on. Or what will happen is the first round of voting will lapse. No one will get enough to secure the nomination, at which point superdelegates come into play. And they will probably vote for the establishment candidate. That will leave the left pretty pissed. It will be a replay, I think, to some degree of the 2016 election, where people don't feel like there was a fair primary
Right.
process,
The
like
fix
they
is
didn't have a
in.
voice. Yeah, and then people will still campaign for the Democratic candidate, but there will be misinformation campaigns from foreign actors. There will be campaigning that is probably potentially lukewarm. I mean, not presenting a grand vision. And I think Trump will probably get reelected if that's the case. I mean, I hope not, but it's looking like that would be the case if there is a brokered convention and if there's still that rift and tension. Despite the best efforts by everyone in the Democratic Party to campaign for their lives.
Right.
I think that's what will happen.
And then
In
how will
terms
the presidency evolve once Trump is reelected in that scenario?
Man, beats me. No, no, I think we're in for another 4 years of madness, and it's 4 years that we really don't have. I mean,
Yeah.
there's only so much time. If you thought President Bush, W. Bush, burned up a lot of our capital on the world stage with our allies and with other nations, Donald Trump burns it at a way faster rate.
Yeah.
And that's
Well,
not even taking into account the issue of climate change, which seems like the projections keep getting worse and worse.
and the entitlements. Apparently, I just heard that by 2025, that's when the money is going to run out for all the government pensions. At the same time, the baby boomers are living longer. There's underfunding, more deficits. So,
I've actually read it's 2030 to 2033, and that's actually not too hard of a thing to solve. I know that sounds crazy, but it's actually easier to solve. The problem with a lot of Social Security and the entitlements is that the projection is that we'll get to 70% payout. The number of people in the system paying in will only match 70% of the payouts. So maybe there are some cuts. That wouldn't be great, but you can solve that, without cuts or without means testing or without raising the age for entitlements. The way you could solve that is by simply raising right now, I believe it's people who earn more than $130,000 a year don't pay FICA taxes. So that's like That's like your Medicare and Social Security
Mm-hmm.
taxes. The 7.5% that you cover and the other 7.5% that your employer covers. Why is there a cap?
Right,
That
right.
makes no
Oh, I didn't
sense.
realize that.
If the entire idea behind Social Security and Medicare is that these are just universal programs to ensure social security,
Right.
it beggars belief that we say, but once you earn more than 130K or whatever, then yeah, you're good. You sign off on that. It's like, no, I mean, it's a universal program. There should be universal payment into it, no matter your income. The cap seems weird, and getting rid of the cap would go a long way toward resolving that issue.
Yeah.
So, yeah, sorry, it was a bit of a
No, no,
wonky,
that's good.
but it's like these solution. I guess the larger point here is that there are solutions out there. It's just that the political will to actually enact
Hmm.
them doesn't exist, or is stymied by the way our system is set up.
Right. Yeah, and I know that there have been a lot of bills proposed for pension reform, entitlement reform, but they never pass because it's never popular among voters. So I think what you're suggesting is most likely to be the most popular path forward because it's just on the people who are making more money, but it still may not be so easy to pass, just because of the subject matter is, rock hot. Um, but yeah, I guess for my most likely scenario, it really is in the middle of the best and the worst. So if the best is, Trump gets defeated, it's just some blip in the history books of, oh, those crazy Trump years, and we study it with fascination, but it's more normalcy from here on out. That is obviously great, but it doesn't seem realistic. And the worst case also, where Trump consolidates all power and it essentially moves more towards a principate, like you were saying, that also maybe seems a little more likely than the best case, to be honest. But it still is not super likely. There's always a reactionary force. Like for every yin, there's a yang. So for my most likely, I agree with you that I think it's most likely that Biden will win the nomination, but it's not going to be everyone unified behind him. It will be somewhat split. I am going to be more optimistic and say I actually think Biden, if nominated, will beat Trump. And I think that there are going to be a few more twists and turns with the Senate trial than maybe we're expecting. Like I think I'm a little more optimistic that maybe witnesses will be called and it may damage Trump somewhat. I think it'll damage him more if he's against a moderate like Biden than if he's against if it's like Warren or Bernie. I think it will actually, I agree, it'll energize his base more so than damage his base. But I think basically once Biden defeats Trump, there is going to be the results of the election called into question, and that's going to be painful. And what's going to follow is an era of a lot of divisiveness continued, and it's going to take time to heal the divide. Biden may not be able to get much done because there is still so much divisiveness, and because the Trump supporting faction of Congress and just the system will still be present enough, and the media will still be present enough to prevent the major changes that need to be made. And it may not be until the next election, which if Biden's elected, he probably, I mean, who knows, but he may not even run for the next election. I don't foresee us really sort of healing the divide until that next election in 2024. And by that time, I actually feel it is more likely than not that in the next 10 years, there is a recession. Even in the next 8 years, there is a recession. And if there is a major recession, it could either go the way of an opportunity for Trump and the Republicans to secure even more power, right?
Hmm.
Or it could also be the other way where it's like people sort of realize that this strategy is no longer working. We need to really do something that helps the people, whether it's UBI or healthcare or universal college care or something like that. And it kind of reminds me of a quote, which is that things are going to change whether they happen before or after the revolution.
I think it's worth pointing out that after 2008, there was a recovery and there was a stimulus, and President Obama tried to act in good faith. The Republicans only wanted a stimulus if there was a bunch of tax cuts on it. And they didn't even want the stimulus to be that big. A lot of people didn't recover, and were arguably, a lot of people live as though they already are in a recession. And I think that's what led to people just saying, fuck it, I'll vote for Donald Trump.
Exactly.
Like, people don't, and it's got to get to, unfortunately, I think it will get to a point where enough people are materially disadvantaged enough to say, hold on, the way we're doing this, the way we structure our political economy, I mean, just the way that government interacts with the private sector and the way that private sector interacts with the public and the public interacts with government, it's not working. Something's got to give.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about in The Future of Wealth how every time there's a recession, the income gap and the wealth gap widens, because all the rich people can buy assets that are cheap and build on their wealth, whereas people who are already struggling financially, they're the ones who are gonna go into bankruptcy court or foreclose their house, so it is going to get a lot worse if there's a recession. The question is whether the blame game of like blaming immigrants is still going to play, or if people are going to realize, oh no, it actually kind of is, Wall Street's and crony capitalism and basically taking the dollar off the gold standard and printing tons of money and not caring about paying our debts and just this whole inflationary, house of cards. So I'm not totally certain what that will be, but it seems like maybe I'm too optimistic, but it feels like the same trick can't work twice, especially if it's worse this time around and people will start to wake up.
Yeah, I think that's for certain. And I think as things get more uncertain in terms of like our basic weather, I mean, I'm in DC right now and it's January and it's like 55 degrees. That's not normal. I mean, it's not normal for there to be a 70-degree day in New York like there was a week ago. When enough of people's day-to-day lives become impacted, then things change. And let's hope it's for the better and not for the worse. And, you got to work for the better and not for the worse. Right.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you, Brett, for joining. It's a great discussion, as always.
Yeah, as always. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you to our listeners. This has been The Future of the Presidency, and we'll see you next time.
What will inevitably happen.
The past, the present.